Hello and welcome to the Bozeman Beat, the City of Bozeman's podcast where we have conversations about issues our city and our community cares about. I'm Mayor Joey Morrison, the host of this podcast, where we'll be having interesting, funny, but nonetheless real conversations about this community. We'll be chatting with people across the community to shed light on things the city's involved in and things we may not be involved in but are still important to our residents. In this episode, we're going to be discussing a topic that has never really left the City of Bozeman's conversation: housing. Here with me to discuss this is David Fine, our Community Housing Manager and Urban Renewal Program Manager. David Fine, as many people probably know him in the community, is sort of the city's housing guy. He's been with the city for about 12 years, serving in the Urban Renewal Program Manager seat for several years and focusing on housing specifically over the last 4. Folks that are regular listeners of city commission meetings have certainly seen David before, have heard a presentation or two by him, and know sort of the background and expertise that he brings. Something that people may not know about David is that he's a big theater guy. He served on the board of Verge Theater, a beloved theater and performing arts nonprofit in town, and did some comms and performance work in undergrad. And so really excited to have that experience coming together in now a role where you got to spend a lot of time in front of people. And so we're really excited to have him here today.
Thank you, Joey.
Okay, I think where we should start is really just zooming out. The big picture of what we're seeing in the country that plays out, of course, in the state of Montana and in our community. What are the housing trends that we're seeing play out versus what are we seeing play out locally? Like, what's the translation from national trends to our context here in Bozeman? And what does that look like over the last, 5 to 10 years?
Sure. So, I think we're not immune from national trends. Like, real estate investment is a kind of investment, and that definitely shows up here in our community. But to the extent that people are trying to make money building housing, and unfortunately or fortunately, however you want to think about it, that's how housing gets built here. It's primarily a private process with some government intervention, a little bit on the zoning side or the other side. But here in Bozeman, a couple years ago, there was almost no vacancy in our market. And so we had this kind of thing where the market in Bozeman collided with a national trend, producing a pretty dramatic result. And so we had almost no vacancy. We had a mobile population of people who are moving here for remote work and other sorts of things. And at the same time, there was just sustained national investment in multifamily, in apartments for rent, right? And the big thing driving that trend was super low interest rates, right? And a lack of supply that had happened nationally over 10 years. So there was a lot of interest from people who wanted to build apartments as part of a national trend. They could do so more effectively because there was low supply nationally. There was a strong price signal for that. And then here locally, there really just was an incredible lack of supply and a ton of demand all at once. And so those things came together and produced a lot of apartments in Bozeman. And so we went from seeing below 2% vacancy in our market to in excess of 12% vacancy in our market. So I think, it is local. There are some strong local signals, and there is also kind of a national wave that we caught of investment in apartments.
So I there's 2 pieces that you mentioned that I want to follow up on that I think we hear a lot, either in the commission room or, calls that we receive or public comments or even just literature that's being published out in the world, is this question about, housing moving from, this human right that people need to have shelter to, I think the kind of the buzzword for it now is a financial product. That at the end of the day, housing is built largely through people that want to make money with a machine that relies on investment to make that happen. And what I think we've heard through other media and through the development community saying, if you want to try to raise money to build single family homes or apartments, you can find it. But if you want to find investment to build missing middle housing, row houses, and things like that. It's hard to get that. And so, how do we look at that trend? And first, I guess, is that square up with what you're seeing? And second, how does that play out as we're trying to figure out, we need a different type of housing than what the investment world is willing to invest in? And how do those things translate to the type of housing we see come online?
Sure. So, I mean, I think, housing is definitely um, a financial asset, especially on the multifamily construction side. I don't think there's necessarily any getting around that. Um, but it's not, I I think a lot of people mistake the direction of causation here. Like
Sure.
it gets built as an investment because of a general scarcity in housing. Like it's a productive investment because it is leveraged, right? It's a mix of debt and equity, which magnifies returns, but it also is successful because coming out of the 2008 recession, housing production just stopped across a lot of the country. And so for over a decade, we've been playing catch up, and we've been playing catch up at a time when there are fewer people working in construction trades, as a lot of people stopped doing that. And so we have this just kind of like it's profitable right now because it's expensive to produce and there's a shortage, which means people end up having to pay more for it. But it's not necessarily expensive because it's built expensive and priced expensively. It's expensive because it's expensive to produce, and also there's a shortage. So the people who are building it have had pricing pressure up until recently. But as part of this national trend, so many people built so much housing that markets kind of worked the way they were supposed to. Sure, yes, they are brand new apartments, and brand new apartments are almost never going to be the cheap apartments, but it has caused the prices to come down at the margin there.
Yeah, I think to follow up sort of on your first answer and this one is this question about vacancy rates.
Yeah.
And what do vacancy rates mean for a housing market? What do they mean for absorption and the trends that we're seeing? I think there's some that say, oh, now Bozeman is in this disastrously overbuilt environment. When even if we look, at our current growth rate, those units will still be absorbed quite quickly if we just completely stop building at all. But in the same vein, we're still seeing, I think in some people's eyes, a mismatch between the demand for the type of housing that we need, either single family homes, row houses, et cetera, versus apartments. How do those two things kind of come together? How did the vacancy rates translate into, cost, affordability, et cetera? And how do those vacancy rates translate to maybe a change in what the market's trying to build for us?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things that's happening with vacancy rates right now is that it has significantly slowed the development of new multifamily apartment buildings. So we had a lot of them for a while, and we're getting far fewer of them. They're harder to build, they're harder to finance, they're harder to get equity for, because everyone can look around at the data and say, we built a lot of housing. At the moment, though, that's an opportunity to provide some downward pressure on rents. Like if you were interested in getting a brand new, better amenitized apartment, you can get one available, and there's 2 to 3 months free rent right now. But I think that when people move up into these nicer, newer apartments, that leaves some vacancy in the older housing supply, and that makes those rents go down too. So supply is an important part of keeping Bozeman more affordable, but it's not the only thing that causes Bozeman to be affordable. And there is a lot more capital to build multifamily. One of the things about you've talked a little bit about maybe the investment is mismatched, is so much of our for sale housing is built by smaller builders. They buy a lot or 2 or 3. A really big builder in our market builds 30 homes a year. And so, they're often building single family homes, partially because just there's a lot of risk for them if the home doesn't sell right away. The way they make money is they need to sell that home, and they need to buy a lot and start building their next home. And so there is a mismatch. We don't have builders here that are building, 400 homes at a time. We don't have the big national builders in this market. And I think for like having interesting neighborhoods, that's probably a good thing. But in terms of having like real investment in more affordable housing types, it makes it a lot harder to not have any of that happening at scale. Because if all the homes need to be built by small builders, it really makes things that are more accessible, like townhomes that are on smaller lots, harder, because now they have to deliver and sell 4 homes all at once and take the risk of having 4 homes out there before they can do their next project.
Sure.
And that's something that's a lot harder for smaller builders. And so there's not capital to make that happen at a little more scale that we might need to see it push down townhome construction.
So I think really following on that is to drill down a little bit deeper on this mismatch between what we're hearing some in the community say, this is the type of housing that we want. Certainly peers of mine, folks in their 30s, early 40s, late 20s that are looking to be first-time home buyers and are looking for things that are smaller, a townhome or a row house. But it doesn't sound like that's maybe translating to certainty for folks who would build those. It sounds like there's still a feeling that, oh man, that's too much of a liability, either to pay back an investor or to make a return on. Is that largely the trend that we're seeing?
I think that's true. And I think that the other reality here too is that just materials are expensive and just labor costs are very expensive. Like right now, it's a vicious cycle, because if you're a builder, you're paying contractors, subcontractors, tradespeople who have to afford to live near here, which means their housing costs is part of the cost of housing in a really meaningful respect. And so, we're seeing building costs that are, $100 per square foot more, or even more than that, than other markets. I've talked to developers who are trying to build in the Southwest, and they can build for under $200 a square foot. We're lucky to be under $300 a square foot. That makes it really hard to build a more affordable home. I mean, I think for a lot of people who are trying to buy their first home, yes, we'd like to see more of that kind of missing middle townhomes ownership product. But if it really can't be delivered for less than $550,000, that's a pretty expensive starter home for a lot of people. And it creates more risk for the builder, and it also just makes it harder for someone who's trying to buy one.
So I think if I hear from an architect or even just a concerned constituent or someone who's thinking about building an ADU, the cost per square foot is immediately the calculation that comes up, that they're throwing around these insane numbers that we can't believe that that's all we can build for. What are all of the things that I and listeners should know about the things that stack up to contribute to the cost per square foot to build a house or to build an apartment in Bozeman?
Right. And the easy way to think about this is we talk about the four L's: land, labor, lumber, lending. Lumber really is a shorthand for building materials generally here. But like those are the things that drive the cost of housing. And the really big one here is labor. Land costs are an important input. It is the largest single input, but across all housing, that labor, the cost of every square foot of construction is really the thing that makes housing so expensive. And this comes up a little bit when people talk about building heights. Taller buildings, more density, they definitely increase the overall supply of housing. They do it more efficiently. They do it in a way that maximizes our long-term investments in public infrastructure and allows us to spend less money maintaining that infrastructure over time. It's more compact, it's more walkable, it's more environmentally sustainable. You're more likely to have a neighborhood that has stuff in it, right, with density. But going taller doesn't necessarily always drive down the cost. It just allows a developer to get a little more out of that land cost per unit that they have. But that's a fairly small amount of the overall price of a housing unit. Like adding more density might allow you to drop the land cost per unit from like $100,000 per unit down to $80,000 per unit. But that really only makes it maybe $20,000 worth of subsidy, right? And so, I think that cost, that overall cost of construction, even if you add stories, every square foot still costs this high number. And so it's really difficult to get affordability when it costs so much to build in this market.
I think as you're, bringing up um, this conversation about height versus affordability, I think has been at the forefront of the city's unified development code process. It's and extreme arguments on both sides have arisen, and of course, often in these conversations, that the reality is somewhere kind of in the middle. That um, height is not necessarily the bastion of affordability. However, it is not the antithesis of affordability. There are reasons why cities build more upward for a variety of reasons, whether it's public health, water efficiency, et cetera. What are the things that we've seen as trends in Bozeman over the last couple of years as we have been building, higher density for Bozeman standards, higher density, taller buildings, more multifamily? What are the things that we're seeing play out in those trends?
Sure. So I think one of the key things for people to think about is the way that the type of building, the construction types, how it relates to building code, and then the underlying land cost work together to produce what you're seeing on the ground, right? And so building code wise, it's really efficient. Probably the most efficient thing you can build is a 3-story walk-up building. Elevators are really expensive. You can put in stairs, use simple wood frame construction. There's all kinds of different contractors who can do that. It's essentially the same kind of construction you use to build your house, right? And so when land is cheaper and you can surface park and you can spread things out a little bit, you're going to see a lot of like 3-story apartment buildings. When the land gets a little more expensive, you're going to make the jump up to a 4-story building, but now you're typically adding elevators, which increases the cost per square foot everywhere. So if you're looking around town and you're saying, well, how do apartments look on the west side or in the newer parts of the southwest side of Bozeman? You're going to see 3- and 4-story apartments. Like that's how this works. And the land is cheap enough there that they're not going to go for that 5th story, typically, unless it's really well located. For a developer to justify going for 5 or more stories, getting to what's called a podium building, where now you're using concrete and steel and sometimes underground parking and so things, it's an order of magnitude more expensive, right? And so a developer is really only going to do that where there's access to amenities, right? So near downtown, there's access to amenities, and where the underlying land is expensive enough and scarce enough that it really calls for putting more density there and having that higher cost. And so that's kind of the relationship between taller buildings and where they get located. It's only going to be where the land's expensive and it's scarce and there's access to amenities where they're even going to bother building a more expensive structure type. And that's really what you see kind of downtown in the B3 area, a little bit less in even Midtown. And it's really the underlying cost of land and access to those neighborhood amenities that drive that.
I think and appreciate you sort of walking through some of the trajectory of these conversations, because I think throughout the UDC, I've spent a lot of time looking at other cities, other communities as to why did they or how did they make a choice to decide to start building upward, to building taller, to either permit taller buildings or try to incentivize taller buildings for a variety of reasons. And so, cities all across the West, they do so to preserve the natural environment nearby, to build more densely within, to prevent some of the sprawl pressure to grow into the rural community, to reduce commute times, to get people out of cars and allow people to walk and things like that. I think these are all similar ambitions that are baked into the city's growth policy. How do those, as we're looking to this conversation about sprawl versus building upward, almost probably half of Tuesday nights it comes up. What are the realities of what we see as the pressures that either push development out of the community or build upward in our community? And not necessarily as far as what they translate to affordability, because we know that there's, as we've just covered, there's a lot of different factors that contribute. But I think just specifically on, hey, do we want to protect the natural environment of this valley or not? Feels like a central part of our question about sprawl versus density.
When I think about sprawl versus density, I where my brain actually really goes is towards thinking a little bit more about our relationship to cars. And it's a huge factor because when you think about cars, you have to think about parking and where the cars go and where the cars drive. And so there's so much of how we build is based around our preferred transportation mode, and our ongoing commitment to that creates a cycle where we almost can't get away from it, right? So like when you're building apartments, when you're building housing, there's often parking attached to it. And with a lot of apartments, if you had two parking spaces for an apartment unit and you're surface parking it, the square footage devoted to parking on the land is actually about the same size or even bigger sometimes than the apartment itself, right? And so even with some of these big apartment complexes on the south side, the west side, people are seeing these apartments everywhere. The housing itself is only covering like 30% of the land, right? That's a pretty meaningful cap on density. And it's also, but I think it also leads to part of this conversation we're having, right? It's if we want walkable communities, if we want housing that is near shops and restaurants. I mean, how many times, Joey, have you been in a city commission where you're like, you know what this new neighborhood means? You're going through like preliminary plat or something. It needs a coffee shop. I was like, well, like you can't make money in a coffee shop without a certain number of people coming in the door. And you got to be a pretty good coffee shop for someone to stop, park, go inside, do all this stuff. But with a neighborhood coffee shop, you got a lot more people walking in there. So I think when we like think about density, it's tricky to think and sprawl. The fact that we remain so dependent on our cars drives sprawl, and it also drives how we build. So like, downtown where it's scarce, the few places that are more walkable, we're going to get taller buildings because there's just so much demand to be near something that's walkable and that we can do things for. And yet even then it's harder for people to get away from their cars. And then in places where we don't have the density and we don't have the commercial development, it's going to be more sprawly because you just can't get the density to replicate what we have downtown without it being so much more dense somewhere else in the community.
As I've been looking into, why are communities making this choice around auto dependence, et cetera, that leads to sprawl, that I appreciate the point that you brought up. It's inexplicably linked to the history of our country, right? Our cities aren't European cities that grew to 1 million or more in population before the creation of the automobile. Most of our cities grew and developed alongside the auto industry. And so consequently, we built our cities to accommodate that. And now we're in a position where, in the American culture, we're willing to say, I'll live in a suburb 5 miles from town because I like that experience. And I'm okay with that trade-off of getting in a car and driving all that distance. And now I think this is a challenge that I feel as a policymaker, as a decision maker, as someone in governance, is for whom are we building a community? As we look to the trends of younger and younger generations, more and more and more are folks in my generation, Gen Z, et cetera, willing to say, I will live in a smaller place. I will pay maybe a little bit more, or I don't necessarily want to have to pay the additional fees of owning a car and having to drive everywhere. And so where that runs into this cultural head where I think folks say, well, in Montana, we're immune to that. That's not true in Montana. Young people still want to live in a single family home with a backyard. And of course that's true in some senses, but as we're thinking about the trends of taste over generations, I think this is probably going to end up being our last question that we can spend some time on. And of course, there's more to get into. But how do we try to create the type of housing that the next generation, the people that don't currently own their home, how do we take that into account of what type of policies we're trying to create that build housing in our community?
I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, if you look around cities that were developed pre-automobile, and I can't speak for everyone's taste and where they're going and how that relates to people's choice to live in Montana versus someplace else. I mean, I think these are complicated questions, right? Do people move here and build here because of exactly how it is now, Or are they thinking they want to build this place into something different as it grows and be part of change related to that? But I think what I do know is like single family homes, as we kind of understand them now, are inextricably linked to building cities around cars. It is lower density. You don't get that many homes. It's really hard to locate shops and restaurants near that kind of density. And so when we choose to build single family homes, we are linking our development pattern but also our choices to this lower density mindset and embracing cars moving forward. That's a fine choice. A lot of people make that choice. I made that choice. I live in a single family home at this point. But I think for more sustainable development patterns, more efficiency, but also like having neighborhoods where you can walk to key things, going back towards townhomes and even apartments makes more sense. That's really what you've seen in cities before cars was townhomes and walk up apartments. And so, I think Bozeman as it grows is probably going to have some of both. And I think a key thing is, having places in our town where you can build that more walkable human scale urban density. And there's probably going to be room in our community for people who want a more traditional auto-oriented single family home experience. I think we can do both and still be faithful to who we are.
Yeah, I really agree with that, especially that last sentiment. I think there's sometimes where we hear, sort of skies falling, nobody's building single family homes anymore. And us sort of having to look at the landscape of what we're seeing still exist and what individuals are still able to, buy and construct, that single family homes aren't going anywhere. They aren't necessarily what we need the most. However, they come up spontaneously. They're not necessarily something that we need to spend a lot of energy to try to get off the ground. And so I think we can leave it there. David, thanks again for that conversation. And thank you to the listeners.
Thanks for listening to the Bozeman Beat. If you enjoy listening to this show, please help us out by sharing this episode with a friend or rating and reviewing our show on whichever podcast app you use. If you have feedback, questions, or suggestion for a future topic you'd like to hear us discuss, please email us at podcast@bozemanmt.gov. That's podcast@bozemanmt, as in Montana.gov. Hope to see you in the next episode.